This video is brought to you by Squarespace, the all-in-one platform where entrepreneurs can easily create and customize their own personal or professional website. More on Squarespace later in the video.
So hello and welcome to yet another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host, Karl Small, and today we're talking about Charles XII, the last great king of Sweden. And as with all videos here at Biographics, this one is based on original articles submitted to us by a member of our writing team. That person being, in this case, Ben Edelman. Follow them on social media below if you are so inclined. While you're down there, you can click that like button and you can leave a comment with suggestions or feedback, and then subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. You know what you're thinking, Karl, shouldn't you be asking that at the end of the video? It's like, yes, I should, but YouTube analytics show us that the earlier in the video I asked people to do those three things, the more likely people are to do all three of those things. Isn't that fun? But let's get to it. So at the dawn of the 18th century, Europe found itself torn apart once again by war. So while the great powers of the West were fighting over who should inherit the Spanish crown, in the North, another life and death struggle for territory and honour was taking place. Sweden is a peaceful country today, but 300 years ago, she was a force to be reckoned with, boasting one of the most feared armies in Europe, her kings lauded as warlords without peer. Charles XII seemed to be yet another one of these kings, his generalship proving extraordinary despite his very young age. And yet, for all of his victories on the battlefield, Charles XII would proved to be the Swedish Empire's undoing, as he led his country to disaster with stubbornness and refusal to compromise. It would eventually set all of Sweden's neighbours against him, and he would live to see most of Sweden's vast territorial gains conquered by his enemies before dying in a futile effort to restore the situation. But before that, let's start, as I like to say, at the beginning. Charles, also known as Karl with a C, or the proper spelling Karl with a K, was born on June 17th, 1682 in Stockholm. His father, King Charles XI, who'd have guessed it, had ruled Sweden since he was a small boy thanks to the premature death of his own father. Sweden had propelled itself to the ranks of the great European empires in the 1600s, acquiring vast stretches of territory around the Baltic Sea, largely as a result of victories on the battlefield. They'd even established a colony in the New World called, creatively enough, New Sweden, on the banks of the Delaware River in the modern-day United States. The secret to Sweden's success was the strength of her army. In a time when most armies in Europe consisted of poorly trained conscripts, Sweden had trained a professional military machine that had routinely defeated every single opponent sent up against it. And it's noted that some of the finest generals from this period wore the Swedish crown, including Gustavus Adolphus, the famed Lion of the North. Unfortunately, since most of Sweden's successes had come at the expense of their neighbours, Denmark, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, it left her almost totally surrounded by enemies that just chafed at the chance for revenge. Charles XI had fought numerous wars in the decades before the younger Charles's birth, while also tackling domestic issues caused by the costs associated with Sweden's rapid rise to power. You know, armies don't pay for themselves. Charles was the only son to survive infancy, meaning that a lot of pressure was put on him from a very young age since he was to eventually inherit the crown. Prince Charles was known as being highly intelligent by his tutors, particularly in the fields of science and mathematics. He also learned quite a bit about war, as you imagine, from his illustrious father, regularly accompanying the king on military manoeuvres and troop inspections from a very young age. Charles XI eschewed most of the pomp and circumstance associated with kingship, preferring to dress in rough clothes and eating simple foods. His son followed his example and took it even further still. Throughout his life, Prince Charles rarely drank alcohol of any kind, preferred to sleep rough in the woods, like out with his men, instead of like in his big palatial palace. And he certainly spent more time praying than he did feasting. He also routinely, almost systematically avoided members of the opposite sex. During his lifetime, he never married, fathered no children, and had no mistresses that historians are even aware of. This has caused some speculation in the centuries since that Charles may have been homosexual. It's also possible that he was asexual or just simply driven by his deep religious faith to wait until he found the right woman. And since the only guy who really knows for sure is dead, I guess we'll never know for sure either. Wait a minute, guys, do you hear that? It's the telltale pitter-patter of Business Anteater, here to talk about today's sponsor, Squarespace. I love that I just, out of nowhere, went, you know what? All my sponsor spots is going to have this stuffed anteater in it, and I'm never going to explain it.
You know what? I think Business Anteater needs a website.
Oh, Business Anteater does need a website, yeah. And it needs a website with lots of cookies on it, because I bet anteaters are really good at eating cookies, especially the crumbs. Can you imagine, like, you know, if you spilled cookie crumbs on the floor, you had an anteater come in and just go...
Little Hoover.
Well, today's sponsor is Squarespace, an all-in-one website platform you can use to create a beautiful website just for anteaters.
Well, you can make a website about anything that you wanted to do, and anyone out there who's ever tried to make a website and gone, screw this, knows that a service like Squarespace is incredibly useful if you don't want to be sat there going, screw this.
So I'm just wondering, what would an anteater website need?
Well, I think you wouldn't understand the fluid engine, Brad, but we humans with our human-sized brains can. What is the fluid engine?
So with the fluid engine, it allows you to customize everything in your website and has like a drag and drop system.
And you know what? Drag and drop kicks so much ass. I love drag and drop. Like, do you know what I don't like? I don't like entering data. I like clicking and going, boop.
Because like you can just easily move stuff around. If you're not happy with it, you could just rearrange stuff.
As someone who grew up in the 90s and had to use Word, I remember trying to drop a, like, Nisha's getting war flashbacks. So you drag a photo into a Word document and it goes, well, I guess this is ruined.
So I think another thing that would be useful for an anteater-based website...
Of course, yes, tell me more.
...would be the various blogging tools that are available, because the anteater could tell its story.
It could, yeah, and like an anteater would be typing so slowly, because anteaters have those big claws. People don't know anteaters that they walk on their knuckles and have these big 3-inch long claws, so they'd be typing like my dad types when he's on his computer like this. That's a fun noise. Oh no, it nearly stopped the recording when I did that.
So yeah, the blogging tools. You can share stories, photos, videos and updates, and Squarespace also allows you to categorize and share posts.
Another thing I think the anteater could utilize is you could create a course on how to be an anteater.
Because if you have a very specific skill or live life experience that other people want to know about, why not charge them to hear about it? Like, and I can just imagine Snoop being there like, are you tired of you gluing a vacuum cleaner to your face and crawling around on all fours? Just imagining that. Just walking around. So thank you to today's sponsor, Squarespace. Check out Squarespace at squarespace.com/biographics for 10% off on your first purchase of a website/domain using the code Biographics. And a fun thing we've been ending on in our sponsor spots is a bonus fact for you, our audience. So guys, would you like to hear about how honey badgers are endangering themselves?
Yay!
So I think it's pretty well known online at this point that the honey badger is one of the most fearless animals to exist. Like, they famously will just attack lions with abandon, and in captivity will frequently escape from captivity to attack lions. We've made an entire video about that in the past. But did you know that, no one really knows how long a honey badger can live for, because they attack other animals that are much larger than themselves with such impunity and throw themselves headlong into danger that they've never seen one die of old age. In fact, while the honey badger is not considered to be endangered, it is frequently at risk of putting itself onto the endangered species list due to how frequently they get themselves killed by walking headlong into things that would kill them, like lions and bear traps and the like. Isn't that fun? Charles XII was propelled to the throne at the tender age of 15 after his father died in 1697 of abdominal cancer. He spent the next few years at home consolidating his power, as would-be reformers found themselves dismayed at the young king's emergence as just as much of an absolute monarch as his ancestors were, if not more so. We say this because while he was unfailingly polite to his advisors and always listened to their counsel, he would ultimately make his own decisions and stick to them no matter how unpopular they proved to be. However, foreign intrigue soon brought the young king into conflict with his neighbours. An alliance was formed between Tsar Peter of Russia, King Frederick of Denmark, and Augustus Elector of Saxony and King of Poland-Lithuania that would direct their combined military might directly against Sweden's. They figured that with a young king on the throne, Charles was 18 when the war began in 1700, and by attacking from all directions at once, they could overwhelm their historic enemy and reverse their territorial losses of the previous generation. So, a pretty sound tactic, all things considered. Charles readied his country for war, directing his army and navy to first attack Denmark, which was attacking his ally, the Duke of Holstein. When he left Stockholm to join his troops, no one realised it at the time, but this would be the final time the king would ever see the capital of the country he ruled. The Swedish fleet outmaneuvered their Danish counterparts to land Charles's army near Denmark's capital, which, what is it, folks? You remember from school? Copenhagen. In concert with allied English and Dutch forces, they bombarded the city for 6 days until Frederick capitulated and was forced out of the alliance against Sweden. Charles now turned his forces towards the eastern end of his empire, particularly the large Russian army commanded by Peter that was laying siege to the city of Narva in the Swedish-controlled provinces of Ingria, today the border between Estonia and Russia. Charles's lieutenants were apprehensive, to say the least, at the thought of facing the Russians. Not only was the Swedish army exhausted from the forced march through hard country and foul winter weather just to reach Narva, but the army that faced them was 4 times larger than their own. However, in a critical twist of fate, the Tsar had left his army on the day before Charles's army arrived on the scene. No one is really 100% sure why. Possible answers range from Peter simply not being aware that the Swedish were on their way there, which makes sense. It was 300 years ago. You could only really tell what was out there as far as you could see, or just simple cowardice, which I personally don't believe when an army a quarter the size of your own is rolling up on you, but this is what historians think. Whatever the case, on November 30th, 1700, as the Swedes approached the Russian trenches outside of Narva, Peter was not in command of his troops. So who was? Well, the man Peter had tapped for command wasn't even Russian. He was a German baron named Charles de Croix, who had been sent from Saxony as a diplomatic envoy, but was asked by Peter to take command because of the lack of experience on the part of his Russian commanders. And the story goes that de Croix refused multiple times to take on this command and had to be plied with alcohol to be basically coerced into doing it. So not only was he relatively inexperienced, did not speak the language of the majority of the men he was leading, but he was also nursing a terrible hangover from Russian vodka. The Swedes, of course, had no way of knowing any of this at the time, and when Charles ordered his army to attack the Russians, his advisors feared the worst. Just as the battle lines were being formed, a ferocious snowstorm whipped up, and Charles' advisors told him to call off the attack until it had all blown over. But Charles rather astutely pointed out that the storm was blowing right into the faces of the Russians while it was at the backs of the Swedes. He wanted to use this to his advantage. The Battle of Narva was a tremendous success for the Swedes and for Charles XII. The poorly trained Russians had trouble even seeing the approaching Swedes until they were almost on top of them, and poor communication meant that de Croix could not bring his overwhelming numerical superiority to bear on his enemies as the Swedes just stormed the trenches and proved their skill in hand-to-hand combat. The result was a massacre, to say the least. The Russians died by the thousands, many of them drowned in the frozen Narva River when the bridge they were fleeing across broke under their weight. By the end of the battle, the Swedes had killed, wounded, or captured some 18,000 Russians, while suffering only 2,000 casualties themselves. Overnight, the Swedish king was the talk of Europe, but Narva turned out to have a dangerous downside too. It made Charles extremely overconfident in the capabilities of both himself and his army, while also causing him to underestimate his opponents, especially the Russian Tsar. With Denmark out of the war and Russia's army annihilated, Charles turned his attention to the last remaining enemy he had, Augustus of Saxony. The Polish king, alarmed by the sudden collapse of his allies, attempted to sue for peace, but Charles would hear nothing of it. Before setting off on his campaign, Charles told the Swedish parliament, rather famously, that he had resolved to never fight an unjust war, but to never end a legitimate one except by defeating his enemies. So the young king would put that into practice now. He swore that he would not make peace with Poland until Augustus had been removed from his throne. To that end, he invaded the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in 1701, allying himself with the Confederation of Polish Nobility that was dissatisfied with Augustus's rule. After capturing Warsaw, Charles marched to Krakow, where Augustus was gathering his army. The two met in the Battle of Klijau on July 19, 1702, when Charles decisively defeated a Polish-Saxon army twice the size of his own force. Augustus was able to escape with most of his army, but much of his prestige in Poland had been destroyed, and Sweden began to attract more Polish magnates to his side. By 1704, he'd actually managed to convince enough to join his side that they managed to vote to depose Augustus and elect Charles as preferred candidate. This is a name that I hope I pronounced correctly because it is very Polish, Stanislaw Leszczynski, in his place. But Stanislaw had no independent power base, which meant that Charles needed to spend even more time and resources fighting Augustus and his allies to keep his man on the throne. It was not until 1706, when Charles marched his army into Saxony itself, that he was able to force Augustus, at sword point, into agreeing to the Peace of Aldenstadt, which confirmed Stanislaw to the Polish monarch and ended Saxony's participation in the war. This had taken some 5 5 years, but Charles had finally gotten what he wanted. Whether it would have any benefit to Sweden, however, his advisors were in grave doubt about. At this point, Charles was in a potentially very powerful position. He had a victorious army, a sparkling, sterling military reputation, and he just so happened to be positioned at the borders of Western Europe, which was locked into a dynastic conflict of its own, the War of the Spanish Succession. The conflict, which pitted France and Spain against England, Holland and Austria, had been raging since 1702 with no clear winner in sight. The injection of Swedish arms on either side could very well tip the balance in either's favour. But Charles declined to take on any role in the conflict to the west, supposedly convinced not to intervene through the personal machinations of the English commanding general, the Duke of Marlborough. This was not the first time that Charles refused to play the role of arbiter of Europe, and like before, it was because he had personal business to settle with his enemy, and in this case, that was Russia. While Charles had been, let's put it diplomatically, busy in Poland, Tsar Peter had been trying as fast as possible to modernise the army that had been beaten so badly by Charles at Narva, and then using it to patiently fulfil his goal of opening up the Baltic Sea to Russia. In 1703, he founded a new port city on a site of a captured Swedish fortress, naming it St. Petersburg, and the next year finally captured Narva after a long and costly siege. Peter had captured much of Sweden's eastern territory, but not all of it, including the main Swedish fortress of Riga in modern-day Latvia. Charles' advisors had been begging him for years to end his seemingly unprofitable campaign in Poland and concentrate on Russia, who they viewed as the real enemy. But Charles would not be persuaded. He was convinced that Peter and his army were no real threat, easily dealt with when he was good and ready, just as he had done many years before, ignoring the fact that it was only by a confluence of remarkable good luck that he was able to win the first time. On New Year's Day 1708, Charles was finally ready. He led his army not to recapture the Baltic territories he'd lost, but an audacious invasion of Russia itself. He ultimately aimed to march directly on Moscow, the Russian capital, take it and force Peter from the throne just as he'd done to Augustus. And it was certainly a bold move, too bold in the opinion of his advisors, but Charles would not be persuaded. He was an absolute monarch in every sense of the word, and he had to listen to no one's counsel, either in Stockholm or on the battlefield. Initially, Charles met with some success in the field, just as he had everywhere he'd gone since 1700. He was able to take advantage of the weaknesses in the Russian command structure. Once again, the Tsar was not with his army and the two leading commanders, Sheremetov and Menshikov, who were said to have clashed on strategy in the monarch's absence. The result was another decisive victory for Charles at Holzwyn in July 1708, which allowed Charles to continue onwards with the invasion unimpeded, directly towards Moscow. Unable to defeat the Swedes outright, Peter and his generals instead turned to a scorched earth strategy, clearing the countryside for miles around the Swedish army's advance of any food or resources. They lured the Swedes deep into Russian territory, not offering battle, but instead wearing Charles down through sheer attrition. And then the winter set in, and anybody out there who spent any real time online consuming content around military history knows there's one real rule when it comes to warfare in Europe, and that is don't invade Russia in the wintertime. A rule Charles XII was seemingly not aware of. So Russian winters have a pretty nasty reputation, but this particular winter was one of the coldest Europe had seen in 500 years, and the Swedish army suffered terribly. By the spring of 1709, half of Charles' soldiers were gone, frozen, or simply starved to death. But still, the Swedish king would not retreat. Instead, he laid siege to the town of Poltava in Ukraine, hoping to seize the supplies stored there. Instead, it was where Peter found him. The Russian army Charles faced at Poltava in 1709 was not the same one he'd been in Narva in 1700. The Tsar had done much to reform his troops as part of his mission to westernize Russia from the ground up. It was also massive, numbering some 75,000 men. The Swedish army wasn't the same either, worn down by hunger and almost a decade of near constant campaigns far from home. They numbered less than 20,000. Making things worse was the fact that Charles was unable to lead his army personally. He'd been wounded in the foot some days earlier and couldn't walk or ride. He was resigned to being borne on a litter at the rear, forced to leave active command to his subordinates. And it was probably around this point that the Swedish king realised he'd been led into a pretty nasty trap by Peter. He reasoned the only way to keep himself from being starved into submission was to attack the Russian army before their fortifications were complete. So, on July 8, 1709, the Battle of Poltava began. As they had many times before, the Swedish troops advanced gloriously against their enemies with all the valour that a century of victories could give an army. And they fought quite valiantly too, as they had before, but this time there were simply too many Russians. Russians that were disciplined enough to stand up under the musket fire and go toe-to-toe with the Swedish lifeguards in hand-to-hand combat. This time it was the Swedes that broke and ran, Charles having no real choice but to go with them as he watched his army disintegrate before his eyes. 3 days later, at, this is a word, Perevoloshna, the destruction of the Swedish army was made complete. The remaining troops were compelled to surrender to the Russians, unable to go any further. Only Charles and 500 cavalry escaped, crossing the border into territory controlled by the Ottoman Empire. The Ottomans were no friends of the Russians, and they welcomed the Swedish king, who set up court in exile in the fortress of Bender in Moldova. He ended up spending the next 5 years there, refusing several peace proposals that would see him return to Sweden. It was like Charles was just unwilling to concede defeat, instead occupying himself with diplomatic intrigues. His most successful effort, I guess, was convincing the Ottomans to go to war with Russia in 1710, providing the king with a huge Turkish army to do battle with Peter. But the Tsar had intrigues of his own and successfully bribed the Grand Vizier into making peace with him, sending Charles back to Moldova. The rest of his schemes, ranging from clandestinely supporting the Jacobite rebellion in Britain to bribing Indian Ocean pirates to colonise Madagascar on Sweden's behalf, were somewhat less successful. In the meantime, Sweden suffered defeat after humiliating defeat as Russia conquered the rest of Sweden's Baltic possessions, including Riga in 1710, and then invaded and occupied Finland as well for good measure. Meanwhile, Sweden's defeated enemies rose back up again, as enemies are wont to do, Augustus regaining the Polish crown and Denmark resuming their attacks against Swedish possessions. And as if all this wasn't bad enough, more enemies decided to help stick the boot into Sweden, with opportunistic Prussia and Hanover entering the war hoping to grab some territory for themselves. So at this point, virtually all of the territory outside of the Swedish homeland was lost, her entire empire collapsed and carved up. And still, Charles would not give up. He only returned to Sweden in 1715 when he realised there was a real risk of losing his crown if he did not come home, to the country he ruled. Not to mention, he'd kind of worn out his welcome with the Ottomans, and one attempt by his host to remove the king and his retinue from Bender in February 1713 actually ended in a full-scale battle between the erstwhile allies. The skirmish at Bender, or the Kalabalik, resulted in the deaths of over 200 Ottoman janissaries as well as 20 Swedes. So yeah, he'd kind of worn that welcome paper thin. When Charles finally returned to Sweden after 15 years away, he found his kingdom in pretty dire straits. His demands for more troops and war materials over the years had decimated the Swedish economy. There were no more young men to work the fields. Manufacturing and trade had all but dried up because, the country was now surrounded on all sides by hostile neighbours. And the population of his domains had shrunk by more than 10% since he'd left. And yet, despite all of that, Charles still would not make peace, not without the restoration of all the territory that he'd lost, which nobody was willing to agree to because they'd already kicked Sweden's ass. So instead, he set about rebuilding his army again so that he could once again go out on a campaign again. This time his target was Norway for some reason, because why not make an enemy of those two? Controlled by the Danish, he felt that if he could wrest Norway from his enemies, he'd have open access to the North Sea, which would restore his trade links, particularly with the Dutch. It would also hopefully knock the Danish back out of the war. Charles invaded Norway in 1716 and briefly managed to occupy the capital, Christiania, today Oslo, but he suffered a humiliating defeat and a number of setbacks, including the destruction of his supply fleet by the famed Norwegian naval hero Peter Tordenskjold, who I hope I'm pronouncing that guy's name correctly, because I've actually made a video about him over on my channel FactFiend, and over in that video we don't call him Peter Tordenskjold, we refer to him by his much cooler, easier to pronounce nickname of Peter Thunder Shield, so given to him because he was declared to be the thunder that struck down the enemies of his nation's people and the shield that protected their waters. Not one to be put off, Charles tried again in 1718, this time at the head of an army of some 40,000 men. This time, instead of marching just straight to the capital and trying to depose the ruler, he would first seize the border fortresses that had barred his path last time, starting with one near the town of, and again I hope I pronounced this correctly, Frederiksskjald, which is today Halden. The 1,400 men inside the fortress did manage to fight back quite ferociously, but steadily the Swedish trenches gained ground. And that night, Charles rode to the front lines to inspect the ongoing siege works, and, as he often did, rose himself head and shoulders above the trench line to look at the walls with his spyglass. The king was used to exposing himself to danger while on campaign. He was usually in the thick of fighting in most of the battles and had sustained several wounds, some serious. But this time, however, his luck ran out. An unknown Danish soldier, who most likely had no idea who he was aiming at, because the king, like his father, liked to wear simple clothes, shot the king in the head with a musket round. Charles XII slumped to the ground, having been killed almost instantly at the age of 36. The king's body was brought back to Stockholm and given a lavish state funeral that was most likely held behind closed doors, because many in Sweden were kind of glad to see him gone. That whole decimating 10% of the population thing tends to do that. So because of his stubbornness, he would never have accepted an end to the war, no matter how many losses he suffered. Like a gambler who keeps going at the casino despite the fact he's lost all his money and is now borrowing money from his friends. Charles was convinced that he could somehow, some way, turn it all around with just one more campaign. The Great Northern War finally came to an end in 1721 with the Treaty of Nystad. In it, Sweden had to accept what was already a pretty obvious reality at that point. The days of empire, of being a leading European power, were over. The void was filled by Russia and Prussia, which became powerful states in their own right, eventually carving up Poland between them. Sweden would never again rise to be a major military power. After playing little more than a bit part in the Napoleonic Wars, the country adopted a policy of harsh neutrality that has only very recently been broken by the decision of the country to join NATO in 2023. The monarchy, meanwhile, would never hold as much power as it had during Charles XII's day. As for the man who would come to be known as Carolus Rex, he has rather a conflicted legacy. Long held up as a heroic figure in Sweden, he is today just as much remembered for his autocratic style of leadership as he is for his victories on the battlefield. And the fact that members of Sweden's neo-Nazi community hold him up as a nationalistic hero hasn't really done wonders for his reputation. But the most intriguing question surrounding Charles XII since his death is usually what may have been. What if he hadn't been so bullheaded in his invasion of Russia? What if he hadn't been so young at the time and made more sensible, mature decisions? How long would Sweden's empire have lasted if he hadn't lost at Poltava? No one will ever really know, but one thing is for sure though, the ghosts of Sweden's glorious past, for better and for worse, will continue to cast a large shadow over her present and her future. So I hope everybody at home found this video to be entertaining, informative and educational. I certainly found the script to be all three of those things, and if you are inclined to agree, you can go follow the author, Ben Edelman, on the social media links below. And while you're down there, as mentioned in the intro, you can like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. We'd like some feedback, suggestions for other figures to cover. You know, maybe there's some people from history we're not aware of. Let us know and we can, get around to telling our authors to go write some scripts about them. And yeah, follow me on social media if you want to. You can find my own channel, Fact Theme with Karl Smallwood. I'd like to recommend the video we did about Peter Wessel Tordenskjold. And to end on, here's a little bonus fact about Mr. Peter Thundershield. He was well known for his skill with a sword, and famously once managed to duel 3 Swedish dragoons to a standstill while he was on the beach. And when they were about to land the coup de grace, the killing blow, he slapped all 3 of their swords aside, dived into the water and swam to his boat while screaming, "Not today!" And for this reason, he is a folk hero. Because you don't have balls that big without somebody making a movie about it. And there is a movie about it, but it's in Norwegian, a language I don't speak. So when I was scraping through it to try and find the pronunciation, I'm like, did they say Peter Skådenskjold? Did they? That sounded like it, but Norwegian's a very difficult language to pass. So I apologise for any Norwegians out there if I pronounce his name incorrectly. Every time I've said it, he's a cool dude. Cheers.